But just in tonight, the president spoke to reporters off camera, but on the record tonight aboard Air Force One. Of note, he doubled down on his threat to attack sites of cultural importance to Iran should they retaliate. He said, quote, "They're allowed to kill our people. They're allowed to torture and maim our people. They're allowed to use roadside bombs and blow up our people, and we're not allowed to touch their cultural sites." It doesn't work that way. Here's what Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said earlier about that issue.
Our own DoD war manual discusses protection of cultural property. So why is the president threatening Iran with war crimes?
Yeah, we'll behave lawfully. We'll behave inside the system. We always have, and we always will. George, you know that.
And with that, I would like to welcome in my panel for this hour. Here with me, White House Bureau Chief for The Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst, Philip Rucker. Washington Bureau Chief for the USA Today, Susan Page. Former senior advisor to Jeb Bush and John Boehner, Michael Steele. And in Stanford, California, MSNBC senior foreign affairs analyst Brett Mcgurk, who has served in senior national security posts on the Middle East under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, and most recently as the president's special envoy leading the global campaign against ISIS. Sir, let me start with you. Can you walk us through, first of all, we got a wow at the table as we were talking through what the president said about the cultural sites in Iran and how the context in which he was putting that. That is something that's clearly been, as Mike Pompeo alluded to, Secretary Pompeo, out of bounds. What is your view on how the president has framed this and how damaging it could be?
Thanks, Casey. I just heard that in my earpiece now, too, and had a similar reaction. When this happened about only 96 hours ago or so, my immediate reaction was, number one, as someone who served in Iraq, there is an immediate sense of justice for the removal of Qasem Soleimani. But number two, we need to presume that we are now at war with Iran. I don't say that lightly. We can hope for the best, but the presumption is we're at war with Iran. And what has happened since then with these statements, the tweets, the reporting, the shifting narratives from the administration, just shows a decision that clearly was not gamed out, was not well thought through. And for the President of the United States to say that we are prepared to strike 52 sites inside Iran with no congressional authorization, including cultural sites, which is clearly a violation of international law, stretches the boundaries of our constitutional republic to a real extreme. It's almost unprecedented. There is no congressional authorization for war with Iran, and I think he needs to go to the Congress and explain what he plans to do and seek an authorization. This is not a limited strike like he did in Syria. This is a big piece of business, and it means war.
You made a pretty strong statement there at the top. You said that we need to presume that we are at war with Iran. How should Americans understand what that means, what it's going to look like, and how it may impact them?
Look, this is an extremely serious situation. We have been in a kind of a covert shadow war with Iran for 40 years. But the president made the decision to remove Qasem Soleimani. And when I say we have to presume we're at war, that means we have to presume a war footing in the Middle East. Look, let's go back. Let's kind of rewind the tape. How did we get here? When the president left the Iran nuclear deal, there was a debate within the administration. One camp said by really sanctioning Iran and trying to just smother their economy, they will come to the table, will be able to negotiate a better deal, they'll behave better in the region. Another camp said, you know, and a lot of Iran experts, actually, they'll fight back. They'll do provocative things. They'll draw us back into the Middle East in a way that we don't want to be, because the overall strategy of the administration is to reduce commitments in the Middle East. For the first year of this strategy, Iran didn't do that much. But starting in May, targeting tankers in the Gulf, targeting Saudi Arabia, shooting down an American drone. And then about 2 months ago, beginning attacks again in Iraq of the kind we had not seen in 8 years. These Shia militia groups had not attacked us in 8 years. So I think the camp that said Iran will fight back and we will be drawn in has been proven right. Since May of last year, President Trump has now sent it's approaching now almost 20,000 American troops to the Middle East. That was not what was advertised when this Iran policy began. We've been in an action-reaction cycle. That shows a policy that was not well gamed out, and now we're really in this thing. And I had hoped that after this action was taken last Thursday night, that the administration would really seek to de-escalate, make clear that we have a diplomatic off-ramp where we have really thought this through. But what has been clear since this action was taken is that none of that is in place. Our allies are extremely nervous. And Soleimani now may get in his death what he wasn't able to get while he was alive. His strategic objective was to see us leave Iraq, leave Syria, reduce our influence in the Middle East, and also for the regime in Iran and Khamenei to consolidate his grip and control on power. And that right now, unfortunately, is what's happening. It's really spiraling and potentially out of control.
A rather dire way to frame everything. Phil Rucker, you were listening to what we were outlining about how this president was talking about the cultural sites, but let's stay big picture here for a second. Mr. Mcgurk talked about this. Jeremy Bash alluded to it earlier. This idea that there were a series of hostile acts from the Iranians over the course of several months that we didn't actually respond to, at least not necessarily in a public way, until all of a sudden we took this huge action that clearly, you cover this president, seems to fit with what we know about his personality and how he tends to react to things like this. Why did it take so long for the president to get to that point? And are we in a more dangerous situation now because of that?
Well, the Secretary of State said today that he thinks Americans are safer today because of what President Trump did. But it seems that there's a lot of uncertainty here, not only abroad with our allies and our allies in the region, but here at home about what could be next, in part because there doesn't seem to be a grand strategy at play. It seems as if the president is reacting day to day to what is happening, to what the Iranians are doing and threatening from halfway across the world. And the president, over the last week, as he was seeing footage on television of the protests outside the American embassy in Baghdad, was really fuming about that, was upset at that imagery, was fearful of being seen as a weak leader, of not being able to defend the American embassy. And he took one of the most extreme actions he could have taken in ordering this assassination. His military leaders brought him a menu of options that ranged in severity, and the president surprised some of the Pentagon leaders, according to the reporting, by selecting this assassination plan. And that, of course, could have rather dire consequences in the days to come. We're going to have to see. And is that the same phenomenon playing out in these comments about their cultural sites? I mean, clearly, is it that the president doesn't know the deal with the cultural? I mean, he seems on a different page than Pompeo, certainly. Well, it's a matter of international law, but President Trump doesn't seem to be bound by international law, at least according to what he's been saying publicly. And this seems to be an escalation in his rhetoric. He's effectively warning the Iranians on Twitter and in this conversation this evening with the press pool traveling with him aboard Air Force One, that he will strike cultural sites in Iran, that he will retaliate with brute force and hit Iran harder than whatever Iran has planned to hit back against the United States in terms of retaliation. And speaking of those comments, there is another piece of news that we want to highlight from the president's comments aboard Air Force One tonight, a reaction to a vote by the Iraqi parliament to expel U.S. troops. The president saying, quote, "If they do ask us to leave, if we don't do it in a very friendly basis, we will charge them sanctions like they've never seen before ever. It'll make Iranian sanctions look somewhat tame." Susan Page, how do you interpret those remarks? Pretty remarkable, given our recent history with Iraq, which we invaded, have tried to establish a democratic government there with some success, but a pretty weak government at the moment. And now we find ourselves through our own actions with the Iraqi parliament after this history of the investment of American money, treasure, lives, with the parliament voting to eject U.S. troops. That is, of course, one of the things that President Trump talked about during the 2016 campaign as wanting to do. But to leave on this basis, I think, is a huge opening for two forces, Iran in Iraq and ISIS. Two of our big enemies would benefit from us doing an action like this. And the president's provocative comments on Air Force One can only fuel the anger that Iraqis are feeling now and their desire to see the end of the American presence there. Michael Steele, how is this defensible from a Republican foreign policy hawk perspective?
I mean, let's be clear. There has long been a greater willingness among Republican hawks, among Republicans in general, to take a hard line against Iran. We all remember John McCain, bomb on Iran. I think we played it
earlier in the show, in fact.
So there's been a difference of opinion on this. So I don't think it's totally surprising to see Democrats expressing skepticism, Republicans expressing support. And I think how that plays out politically will depend in large measure on what happens next, how effective the Iranian response is, how damaging the Iranian response is, and what the president does in response to that.
Yeah. Mr. McGurk, let me just ask to pick up on the point Susan was making about Iran and ISIS and potential added space here. This is an issue you looked at, you focused on. I think a lot of Americans thought that, frankly, ISIS, there was a point, or at least the administration was trying to convince everybody ISIS had been vanquished. Certainly they were at least on the defensive compared to where they had stood before. How big of an opening is this for them?
If we leave, it's huge. Look, we returned to Iraq in the summer of 2014. Not just with us. We went with a big coalition. We built a coalition of almost 80 countries around the world. Almost 20 countries sent their forces to Iraq with us, so they're there today. A total a little over 10,000 from all these countries who are under our umbrella. And we are training Iraqi security forces. We are helping with intelligence. We have a presence all throughout the country. And we also provide a long-term balance against the Iranians. Iran has massive influence inside Iraq. But if we were to leave, the vacuum will be filled entirely by Shia militia groups tied to Iran and extremist groups, including ISIS, in other parts of the country. We'll be right back to where we were. That is a total disastrous outcome. And to all of our allies that went there with us and have their forces with us on these bases, and we are taking these unilateral actions without much consultation, I just know they are extremely, extremely concerned. I hope when you're in the middle of a spiraling national security crisis, and I've been in some of them, you want to try to de-escalate, buy yourself some time, get through the passionate period. But everything President Trump is saying and doing is making it worse. And the Iranians will respond. It might come in a week, it might come in a month, it might come in 6 months. And then we will have to respond. We want to try to make sure we don't get to that point, but that is where this is heading.
And the idea, Phil Rucker, that this is why we ultimately end up leaving Iraq as well under these terms that potentially have the consequences he outlined is quite something considering the history here. Maggie Haberman tweeted over the weekend. She said, "I noted that the president ran on ending Mideast wars. True, but it's complicated. He also said he would, quote, bomb the S out of ISIS, and in 2011 talked about taking Iraqi oil. He didn't run as an isolationist or an interventionist. He ran as both and still does." There are a lot of contradictions in the president's past on this and on how he's looking at the situation now.
There are, and the way the president, this president, thinks about these situations is really through himself and his own self-image. And you know, on the one hand, he wants to be the guy the hero who brings troops home and withdraws from these foreign conflicts and invests that money back home in rebuilding America. And on the other hand, he wants to be the tough commander, wartime commander-in-chief, and be the one to authorize the strikes and be the one to have sort of the biggest historic sort of military actions under his belt. He cares a lot about that. And one through line through the way he's been talking the last couple of days about Iraq is dollars and cents. He thinks it was a huge waste of money, of American taxpayer dollars over the last 2 decades to be invading Iraq, to be rebuilding so much in Iraq. He talked tonight on the plane with reporters about how much money the U.S. invested in building the airfield in Iraq, and how if the U.S. were to withdraw from Iraq, he would expect the Iraqis to repay the United States the money it cost to build that airfield. And so he's thinking a lot about money, too.
Susan Page?
Well, I think what he's also thinking about is Benghazi and Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
I think that one of the reasons it was such a trigger to see those protesters try to break into the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was it was a reminder of both those episodes, which were hugely damaging to the two presidents involved.
Yeah. All right, Brett McGurk, Phil Rucker, Susan Page, Michael Steele, thank you all very much for joining me tonight. It's great to have you.